We have the testimonial song of the righteous. We have 6 outline points. Just to give you a little context, there's one commentator that described this as Isaiah picturing himself among the redeemed of the land in the future. And he's listening to the people, he's listening to Israel and the redeemed express a song of thanks and confidence in God. And that's what we're going to hear. We're going to hear an expression of confidence in God. On the other hand, we're going to see good and evil here, the end of the age, things that are taking place at the end of the age that are towards the good, the righteous, and towards those that are not. Anyway, we begin Isaiah's testimonial song with the contrast of 2 future cities. And that takes us first 6 verses. Chapter 26, verse 1. In that day, and any time we're hearing this phrase, in that day, throughout Isaiah. Anytime you see in that day, it's generally talking about the day of the Lord's second coming. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. So again, it's pertaining to the Jewish people, but I do believe it's a message to the redeemed of all the ages as well. And here's the song. We have a strong city. And that strong city, I believe, is a reference, of course, to Jerusalem. Reason why we have a strong city is God, sets up walls and ramparts for security. He's the one that is setting up the barriers, the protection for this city. That's why it's so strong. By the way, that word city there, the Hebrew there, is actually Yeshua, which means salvation. He sets up walls and ramparts for salvation, for deliverance. By the way, I feel like I need to stop and talk to you about ramparts, because I had to look it up. Even though we sing about it every time we do the Star-Spangled Banner, we talk about ramparts. Well, ramparts are protective barriers. A rampart is a defensive wall of a castle or a building, having a kind of a broad top or a walkway that's on it, but sometimes they could just be protective hills or barriers. That's what a rampart is. It's a barrier. It's a defensive wall. And of course, we sing in the Star-Spangled Banner, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And I said to myself, I've been singing that for many years, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, and I'm not sure exactly what that's talking about. And I said to myself, self, we're going to go ahead and try and research this and find out what he's talking about, because I want to know where the ramparts fit in. Anyway, before that, there's the phrase in the song, Star-Spangled Banner, who's brought stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And I don't know how many of you understand that phrase, that whole phraseology? Raise your hand if you know that. Okay, you do know it, Gene. I ought to put you to the test and have you come up here. But I got a feeling if you started speaking, you wouldn't get off the stage. So, anyway, of course, the broad stripes and bright stars are the flag, and of course, the perilous fight is the fight for independence. Or the ramparts, over the walls, over the ramparts, we're gallantly streaming, and the streaming is the stars and the stripes that were. The flag was over the ramparts, and they were looking at the flag and gallantly streaming, and bombs bursting in air. So you have this picture. Anyway, at least you see what that's talking about now. There's, the ramparts were the walls and the barriers of protection, for, I guess, the revolution, the revolutionary army there. Anyway, so much for ramparts. But anyway, he sets up walls and ramparts for security for this city. And Yeshua, of course, there's that word salvation for salvation. Anyway, verse 2 says, open the gates that the righteous nation may enter. And I believe this likely is a cry from heaven that's saying, open the gates that the righteous nation may enter into this strong city. Now I'm saying, well, aren't there people inside this city already at the end of the age? Well, I read a commentator that said, likely, after the destruction of the last days, the tribulation, the city may be empty, and the city had to be rebuilt. And once it was rebuilt, very quickly, the righteous nation enter into Jerusalem, those that remain faithful, the remnant of Israel. And I got this picture that as we look at New Testament, when Lord turns around and says to the people that have served him and the righteous people, and he says to them, come my people, enter into the kingdom of the Lord, enter into the righteous kingdom. When Jesus was saying that, Yeshua was saying that, enter you faithful, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of the Lord. I almost feel like this is a picture of it, that open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the one that remains faithful. And then at this point, he declares a declaration here, a declaration of peace, to the faithful. He says, the steadfast of mind you will keep in perfect peace. The perfect peace in Hebrew there has shalom twice. Perfect peace, complete peace, shalom, shalom, okay? Because this righteous man trusts in you. So we have this wonderful declaration of peace here. And then he goes on in verse 4, trust in the Lord forever, for in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. And the Lord is referred to as a rock in several texts all throughout Scripture. Of course, we know him as the Rock of Ages, Ma'ot Tzur, the Rock of Ages. But he's also called the Rock of our salvation. And in this particular text, he's called the Everlasting Rock, the one who is firm and secure that you can stand on and trust. And this text is beautiful. When it says, for in God the Lord, there's the Hebrew there is the shorter version of God, which is Yahweh. It's Yahweh, Jehovah, or Yahweh. The name of God, the Redeemer, in an emphatic form to make sure that there's a strength to its presentation here. For in God the Lord, Yahweh, we have an everlasting rock. And this verse is an amazing verse because I feel like you should memorize this verse. And I've memorized it, unfortunately not in New American Standard Version, but in King James. Thou wilt keep him at perfect peace, whose mind and heart is stayed on thee. And I reflect on that verse often because I believe that if you're able to embrace that verse, no matter what the adversity is, no matter what you're dealing with, no matter what struggle, whatever pain you're in, thou will keep him at perfect peace if that person's heart is mine and mind is stayed on you. No matter what you're in, whatever situation you're in, he will give you that peace. Now, you may go through struggle, you may go through a lot of issues, but the peace he promises you in all these circumstances, I will keep him at perfect peace, whose mind and heart is stayed on thee. If I was caught in an elevator or caught and stuck somewhere in Timbuktu, trapped somewhere, that would be the verse that I would reflect on just to sustain me. You will keep me at perfect peace, whose mind and heart is stayed on thee. Don't forget that because it's very true. And every time it seems like that I've reflected on it, there is a measure of peace that I get. Anyway, he gives this declaration of peace, but then he goes back. Remember I told you it was a tale of two cities? Okay, contrast of two future cities. Here's the other city, verse 5. For he, God, has brought low those who dwell on high, the unassailable city. The unassailable city is in the previous chapter. It may refer to the city of Moab that he said would be destroyed. The unassailable city in Hebrew there is Sagav, which is the strong, high, lofty city, supposedly. The unassailable city he's going to make low. Whatever man has or throws up, the adversity, the adverse situation that man has, whatever he throws up against God, it's going to be brought low. Whatever the world has, the worldly city. Many say that this might be Babylon in the future. But anyway, what happens to this city, he lays it low. Okay, and by the way, when he says he lays it low, this is a city that's promised later on in Isaiah that this is a city that's not going to be brought back again. It's not going to be able to be rebuilt. He lays it low to the ground, and he casts it into the dust. And that's the contrast between the strong city. The strong city is saved and secure forever. The unassailable, supposedly the lofty city, is not. That's going to be brought low, and it's going to be ground into dust. And look at verse 6. The foot will trample it. What foot? The feet of the afflicted, the steps of the helpless. They're going to trample this city. The afflicted and the helpless. In other words, it's the afflicted and the helpless who who trample this lofty city. And I couldn't help but think of a text in Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes, which say what? Blessed are the humble, the meek, for what? They're the ones that inherit the earth. They're the ones that are going to trample on the lofty. He also said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So here you see this picture of what Yeshua reflected in the Beatitudes that, hey, you guys, you're going to trample on the lofty city. Eventually, that's going to be your domain, your kingdom. Anyway, so we have this contrast of two future cities. We also have, in our second outline point, the constancy of the righteous. Now, I needed a C word, so I used constancy. I probably have never used it before, but I'm using it now because it fits. If any of you want to figure out what constancy is, it's basically the faithfulness and dependability of the righteous, the loyalty and the fidelity of the righteous. And here we have a description of the constancy, the faithfulness of the righteous. Verse 7, the way of the righteous, the just and the upright is smooth. It's even, it's equitable, it's a path of integrity, but God makes it smooth. O upright one, Isaiah describes and declares unto the Lord, or seeks the Lord. He says, O upright one, you make the path of the righteous level. And I looked at that text and I said, yeah, the path of the righteous is generally a level path. Not that it doesn't have its rocky times, because in humanity you're going to have it. You're going to face difficult times. But I basically feel like he's just expressing here that the way of the righteous is a smoother path. If you want to find out to the contrary, then go try and live a sinner's way or a sinner's path. There's going to be a lot of issues and a lot of problems. You're going to reap what you sow. But the way of the righteous is smooth. It's even, it's upright, it's level. God makes it that way. The book of Titus, Paul admonishes the believers and admonishes Titus that the grace of God has appeared, giving salvation to all men, instructing us that these men should live sensibly, righteously, and godly in this present age. And I believe that's the path of the righteous described in a little bit more detail. Sensibly, righteous, and godly in this present age. And then he goes on and he says, indeed, and talking about the righteous, indeed, while following the way of your judgments, your laws, O Lord, we have waited for you eagerly. We're following your laws. We've waited for you eagerly. Your name, in essence, when he says your name, God's name, the name of an individual is his person. Your name, you, even your memory, your remembrance, your renown, is the desire of our souls. At night my soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit within me seeks you diligently. Now, what do we have here with regard to the righteous? No matter what's going on around the righteous, their path is level. They're eagerly walking in the judgments of the Lord. They're following the way of God's laws. They're waiting for the Lord eagerly. They're remembering God's name and remembering his memory, his renown. That's the desire of their souls. And at night, guess what? They don't leave God either. They're always meditating, longing for in the night watches. The soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit seeks you diligently in the night watches. How many of you, when you go to bed, are usually not real tired, but are a little bit restless, and your mind goes to the Lord, and you ponder the Lord, even while you're in bed, and you're seeking him diligently, or seeking maybe a question that day, you're struggling with something, but it's, you're in the quietness of the darkness of your room, is a good time to be able to commune with the Lord and basically, pour out your heart to him. And I often, when I have something that I'm struggling with or I'm dealing with, especially I'm trying to understand a text, I usually seek him in that time period. But you know what the problem is? 5 minutes later I'm gone. So I'm sleeping and he might have already answered it. But anyway, you're in the night watches. You're looking for him. Here's the picture here, though. That what the faithful and righteous do, no matter if they're going through tribulation or not, what they do is they follow God's laws, they yearn for him, they look to his name and call upon his name, and they remember him, and they seek him at night. That's the pattern that you want to see here. And by the way, that's what we do when we come together. You know, you have a week, and then you come together on Shabbat, you come together on Sunday, wherever you come together, and what you do, what we do, and what John does is he worships, we remember the Lord. We remember our God. We might have gotten caught up in the world and all of its issues and all of its entanglements, but on this day, we remember the Lord when we come together. It's, you know, and for generation to generation, the people of God, they come together and they remember the renown and they remember God. And that's what we've done from generation to generation, God's people yearning for him. Because whatever's going on in the world, this is still our number one desire, is to seek God and to please God and to walk in him, walk in his judgments. Here's the next verse, which is the completion of this second point, which is, I think, a phenomenal verse. He says, the reason why the righteous search for God is they have an understanding about what's going on around them. And the understanding is when the earth experiences your judgments, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. What an amazing insight. I'd never seen that verse before. I might have read it, but I've never seen it. Here's an explanation. It's a principle. The reason why God sends judgments, and judgments happen, is that men might learn God's righteousness. They might learn the righteousness of God, so God puts them through it. Unfortunately, we're going to read in the next text that it doesn't always pan out that way because the unrighteous continue to be unrighteous. But it's fascinating. The psalmist says, it is good that I have been afflicted, Psalm 119, that I might learn your statutes. So the reason why there's these struggles that, you know, if you see a judgment, if you see God's judgment, it's that the Lord is trying to make the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. And that's what's going to happen all the way, I think, into the end, that the judgments, the tribulations come, but the purpose behind it is not just to punish the world, that may be true, punish the iniquity of the world, but that men might learn righteousness. Fascinating thing happened. Of course, we know in 2001, you know, when the trade towers were tragically, bombed by planes and brought down. You know, it's amazing how many people in a tragic situation will turn to God, will look upward, will yearn, will start praying to God, will start getting on our knees. You know, and I don't want to say that that was any kind of judgment because that's not for me to say. But the point is, in difficult times, whether it be a tragedy from a natural occurrence like the tragedy in Florida with the hurricane, you know, people will just naturally just turn to God. I watched an amazing thing when I was watching football last Monday night. You had a man that had to be, a football player that had to be resuscitated. I don't know if any of you saw that. Any of you watching the game, he had to be resuscitated. You know, he almost lost his life. And at that point, you see all these big football players. You know, yeah, they're wondering, but they're all in huddled prayer. They're all praying. They're all coming together in prayer. I mean, the whole thing was like a prayer meeting over this one man. It was like, where'd they turn? Did they turn to the President of the United States? Did they turn to some governor or official? No. They turned to God, because when there's tragedy, when there's difficult situations, usually men turn to God. They learn righteousness. You know, here are these men that probably haven't prayed in a long time, anywhere, you know, on their knees praying, heads bowed. It was an amazing thing to watch, and I'm glad the man is okay, and I hope he'll make a complete recovery. This dear man that had to suffer through it, but it was an amazing thing. Everybody just all of a sudden turned. You know, that's all you saw was prayer on TV. But anyway, when the earth experiences judgments or tragic times or difficulties, the inhabitants of the world oftentimes maybe learn a lesson in righteousness, but not everybody, because as we see at the next outline point, the callousness of the wicked. From the constancy of the righteous, we go to the callousness of the wicked. And in verse 10, Isaiah writes, though the wicked is shown favor, that's grace there in Hebrew, chanan, which is chen, which is God's grace, his favor. Though the wicked is shown favor, he doesn't learn righteousness. He doesn't learn righteousness. Instead, he deals unjustly in the land of uprightness. You know, you might have an uprightness or an upright, governing authority, and they're going by the letter of the law. But unfortunately, you have those among in society that the wicked ones will not learn righteousness. They just will do evil, even in a land of uprightness. He does not perceive the majesty of the Lord. He doesn't perceive the Hebrew word geut there, is he doesn't perceive the excellency of the Lord that's around him. Whether it be God's laws, whether it be God's people, whether it be God's creation, what he does is simply, he doesn't perceive that, and he just goes about his evil way. The wicked is callous. They have a callous heart. In verse 11, Isaiah says, "O Lord, your hand is lifted up." In other words, it's lifted on high. Your works are displayed. They could see it, yet they do not see it. Your works are displayed, but they don't see it. They sometimes see your zeal, it says in the latter part of the verse. They see your zeal. They see your kinah. They see your jealousy for your people. They see you blessing God's people, and they're put to shame by it. They become pale. They become disappointed when they see the blessings come upon God's people. Wicked people are that way, that if a good person is getting blessed, they'll want to tear it down. Indeed, here's Isaiah's conclusion, fire will devour your enemies. The fire reserved for your enemies will come upon that kind of attitude. The callousness of the wicked. So we see the constancy of the righteous, the callousness of the wicked, and then here we have in the fourth point, the converse or the contrary, the opposite futures of both the righteous and the wicked displayed. And I've given you a little bit of a mini outline here. Peace and prosperity are granted the faithful, punishment and destruction upon the wicked. We pick it up in verse 12. We're about halfway through the text, by the way. I hope you're hanging in there. Anyway, in contrast to the wicked, their converse futures of the righteous and the wicked. Verse 12. You, Lord, you will establish peace for us. You will establish peace for us, since you have also performed for us all our works. Isaiah acknowledges that whatever happened has happened in Israel's history. All that we have accomplished, you have accomplished through us. All we have accomplished, you have done for us. Isaiah says, you will establish peace since you've already performed all these things for us. Historically, we know this. We remember this. There's a verse in the New Testament that says, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. We're his workmanship, created in Messiah unto good works. So it's God that works within us. Lord, you will establish peace. You have performed for us, or in us, for us, all these works. And he goes in verse 13 and he says, O Lord our God, other masters besides you, they've ruled us. Heads, kings, Israel had been conquered several times. Isaiah acknowledges that. Lord our God, other masters besides you have ruled us, but through you alone we confess your name. It's your name alone that we honor in spite of all these rulers and masters that glorified themselves, that conquered us. It is you alone that we embrace. And they are gone. These earthly rulers, those that oppressed Israel, they're dead. And here we have the issue that's going to come up with them is in verse 14. The dead of these rulers, the dead will not live. The unbelieving dead, the unbelieving wicked will not live. The departed spirits, Hebrew there is Rephaim. It has a tricky meaning. I can't get into it that much, but it has the ideas of shades or shadows. The dead in Sheol, and we looked at this in Isaiah earlier in chapters, are like, they're there, their presence is there, but there's no manifestation of them bodily. They're shades, they're shadows in Sheol. They're shadows. Their departed spirits will not rise, bodily resurrection, at least at this point, to life. They will not rise to a resurrection of life. You have punished them and destroyed them. You have wiped out all remembrance of them. By the way, that's pretty heavy. That's strong condemnation of what's going to happen to the wicked in this text here. Wiping out all remembrance of them. That's tough when you think about that. But I believe that's going to happen. I think the remembrance of the wicked are going to be wiped out so that we won't stress out or distress over them. You have punished and destroyed them. But on the contrary, with regard to your people, you have increased the nation, O God, and I believe he's referring to Israel. You have increased the nation, a double emphasis there. You are glorified. You have extended all the borders of the land. And I have to stop right there because this is a promise that God gave to Israel, that as we look to the future, as promised in Torah, I believe from the Mediterranean all the way to the Euphrates River, Israel's land will expand and it'll encompass that much. You've increased the nation, you have glorified the nation, and we're talking about the remnant, the righteous that go into the kingdom. So again, the contrary, the converse futures of the righteous and the wicked. You know, departed spirits won't even rise, but here on the other hand, you have prosperity and blessing, you know, an increase of land and an increase of population. Okay. Now point 5, we've only got one more point after this. The chastisements of God's people recalled. Isaiah turns around at this point and talks about the righteous remnant and the path that they've taken. It's a very tough path. He says, O Lord, they, the righteous remnant, they sought you in distress, but they could only whisper a prayer. Your chastening was upon them. You know, it's interesting. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, well, I'm going to get into this in a second, but I want you to know that things can get so taxing and distressing in our lives that it's difficult to pray. And this is what I believe what this expresses here. You know, ever experienced this? Have you ever been so down that you could only mutter a groan to God because you didn't have a lot on your heart, you were just crushed that much? You just, oh God, and you whisper, you basically, you know, have that kind of suffering. And here, he's going to describe Israel's path that they've gone through, okay? As they've been blessed and going to be blessed in the future, they've also gone through this path as well. Arnold Fruchtenbaum believes that this prayer that they utter at this point is at the end of the tribulation time and will bring about the second coming. You know, that's the noted scholar Arnold Fruchtenbaum, that at this point in their distress, they could only whisper a prayer, but it's the prayer that'll bring the coming of the Lord. Your chastening was upon them. Chastening is your discipline. And here's Isaiah describing the discipline that Israel has gone, you know, in their history and leading up to the blessing, leading up to the time of blessing. He compares their distress as the distress of a woman in labor about ready to give childbirth. This is a tricky context here. It's really a little bit complex as I go through it, and I hope you're able to follow it and see some of the beauty in it, because there is a beauty to it. There's a real descriptiveness to it. Verse 17, as the pregnant woman approaches the time to give birth, she writhes and cries out in her labor pains. Thus we were before you, O Lord. So here you have this comparison to a woman in labor, and only you women that have been in labor can relate to this. We men cannot necessarily relate to this kind of pain. But anyway, notice how he includes himself. He says, thus we were before you as a people, like a woman that is in labor that constantly gets heavier and heavier as time goes on, until the tribulation period, and the labor is over, and then they go into the kingdom. And anyway, verse 18 says, we were pregnant. We writhed in labor. We gave birth, as it seems, only to wind. Talk about frustration. That ruach, there's wind. You know, they gave birth, but they didn't give birth to the child. They didn't give birth to what they were supposed to. They just gave birth to wind. There was no result. There was no deliverance of a child. And of course, that deliverance is the deliverance of the redeemed at the end of the age. It wasn't brought about by Israel. It was brought about by the Lord. Anyway, we were pregnant. We gave birth, but only to wind. We could not accomplish deliverance for the earth. And of course, the deliverance there in Hebrew is Yeshua or Yeshuot. We could not deliver salvations to the earth. And when we talk about deliverance of the earth, we're talking about freedom and prosperity and peace. You know, through Israel would bless all nations, right? Well, here Israel's history, they've been going through all this agony and this pain, and yet they couldn't bring about the deliverance of the earth. I believe there's a belief in Judaism that we can heal the earth, that we can bring about this healing and this peace and this prosperity. We could do it on our own. But here Israel, from generation to generation, has just dealt with suffering. And it's the suffering as unto a pregnant woman that is going into labor and harder labor as time goes on. We couldn't accomplish deliverance for the earth, nor were the inhabitants of the world born. Now, the word born there in Hebrew is nafal, and it means fallen. And I've tried to figure this out. It's difficult. What do you mean by fallen? The inhabitants of the earth fallen? Well, the context here is still talking about giving birth. And I believe, as some commentators have said, the fallen means brought to birth. Like the child falls out and is born. Okay, the inhabitants of the world were not born. What are you talking about, inhabitants of the world being born? What I believe he's talking about is the resurrection. The earth giving up, and giving birth to a resurrected people. Giving life, that resurrection. Anyway, I jumped ahead of time. Verse 19, you're dead, Israel, you're dead. Isaiah's encouragement, will live. And in Hebrew actually it says, will live together with my body, Isaiah including himself. Their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy. And here we have a classic text. And there are very few in the Old Testament that specifically declares a bodily resurrection, like a Daniel 12:2 resurrection. For you who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy. Together with my body, we're going to rise, in that time. Here you are attempting and trying to give birth. What the deliverance is going to come, but of course it's going to come when the Lord declares resurrection. Now, I have to stop right here. Arnold Fruchtenbaum believes that, and I believe too, that there's going to be a resurrection of Old Testament saints after the tribulation period prophetically. In other words, those that are in the ground, Old Testament saints, not New Testament saints, because they're asleep and they rise with Messiah at his coming in the clouds, the rapture of the saints. But the Old Testament saints, they're still in Sheol, and they're going to rise, and there's going to be a resurrection. And the Jewish people believe that there is going to be a resurrection from the dead at the kingdom, during the kingdom time as well. So that's a confirmation here. Now, the interesting thing is, in this text, I immediately thought of a New Testament text that is amazing, that connects with this. And that New Testament text, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Perchance. Is there a text that talks about creation giving birth to the sons of God? Anybody? Anybody read Romans chapter 8? Romans chapter 8, who said, there you go. Thank you. I knew, Sherry, you were thinking about that. Please note that Isaiah compares the distress of Israel to the pains and labor of childbirth. This is similar to Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, 19 through 23, the whole creation groans in childbirth, suffering, the pains of childbirth. And we too are groaning and awaiting our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. And again, redemption of our bodies is the resurrection. There's such a connection here. Beautiful. Israel couldn't bring about the manifestation of the sons of God, like it says in Romans 8. The adoption of sons, the redemption of our bodies. But guess who can? Israel's considered the son of God, but there is a son that comes forth from Israel, the eternal Son of God. He is called the resurrection and the life. It's through him. He could bring about our birth from the dead and our resurrection of our bodies. And of course, that's what he does. And of course, when he comes again, I believe that's going to happen. We're going to have the resurrection of our bodies. If we're alive, this mortal shall put on immortality. If we're dead, the perishable will put on the imperishable. So this particular text is so interesting and intricate and fascinating and connects to the New Testament, I believe, in a unique way in Romans chapter 8. It talks about, I believe, the resurrection. And here Israel, all this time, through Israel, the blessings would come upon the world. They would be a light to the nation. But they're suffering, and they only gave birth to wind. Through all this suffering, there wasn't a completion. There was a failed pregnancy. But fortunately, the righteous of Israel will live, will rise from the dead. They will resurrect, but I believe that resurrection comes through the resurrection and the life himself, which is Messiah. And the next verse is even trickier than that. Isaiah says, for your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. Again, the Rephaim, the shades of the righteous. Your dew is as what's that all about? The dew. Well, I don't really know. but I can hazard a little bit of a guess due to commentary help. You know, the dew is basically a time of refreshing in the morning. When you wake up and you see the dew on the grass, that's like the life. That's God providing water to refresh nature. Anyway, it's a time of refreshing. And your time of refreshing will be like the morning dew which refreshes, gives life to the earth. And I believe the refreshing is the resurrection time, the end times. Your dew is as the dew of the dawn, the morning light, you know, when it comes up. And the earth will give birth to departed spirits. Again, talking about the resurrection, you know, during this time. Resurrection of our bodies. You got that? Can you see that picture? This text is probably one of the deepest I've ever come across in Scripture. Anyway, one final point. Isaiah turns again to the coming indignation. And he says, I believe he's talking presently in the present time, and he says, come, my people. Come, my people. Isaiah turns now to the present tense and present circumstances, but I believe this speaks to the people of God in general whenever God's judgments are poured out upon a sinful people, a sinful world. This is what you should be doing. This is the instruction. Isaiah talks to the people of Israel. He says, come, my people, enter into your rooms and close your doors behind you. Hide for a little while until the indignation runs its course. You know what I thought about when I thought about this text? What did you think about? Who closed the doors and let the indignation go past? Who closed the doors? Remember when the flood came? God says, get in the ark, and he shut the doors behind him until the indignation was past. Remember what happened in Exodus? You know, when they went, you know, when they put the blood on the doorpost, they went inside their homes until, you know, even Moses said this. Well, Charlton Heston said it. Let's go in the house until death passes. Okay. Until the indignation, go. Hide in your rooms. There's a time, and I'm going to bring that out in an application. It's a time to go in the house and close your doors, you know, and let the indignation pass. Verse 21, for behold, Hine, the Lord is about to come out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. You're wondering where the Lord is? He's in his place, but he's going to come out of his place. And when that time comes, to punish the inhabitants of the earth for iniquity. And the earth, I like this verse, the earth will reveal her bloodshed. There's a plural there, her bloods, and will no longer cover her slain. Those that are slain or murdered in secret throughout time, covered by the earth supposedly, well, God knows about all that blood. God knows about all that death, all that sin that was done in secret will be revealed and judged. The bloods of the ground, in the ground, all those, the innocents in the ground, they're not going to cover the slain. They're not going to cover it up, you know, because God's going to reveal it. God knows about it, and there's going to be a reckoning. Like Abel, whose blood cried out from the earth, there's going to be a reckoning for all the innocents. And I like that because that's God's justice. You're not going to get away with anything with the Lord. You're just not. All right, that's 21 verses, a very difficult text. I hope you don't mind, but we're going to do a brief review because there's so many things to learn from this text. There's so much instruction in this text, and I feel like I have to summarize it. So if you'll just bear with me, we'll just go through this pretty quickly, and then we'll get to our application. Isaiah's testimonial song, there's 8 key observations here. First observation, first of all, we saw the divine or future protection of Jerusalem. We saw a city saved and secured by God, a strong city, a city open to a righteous nation. You know, by the way, righteous nation is Goy Tzadik. In other words, Goy is thrown in there. Goyim, you think it's a bad word. Well, Goy just simply means nation. Goy Tzadik, righteous nation. City open to the remnant. Having been rebuilt for the surviving remnant, the city is open to that. We saw a declaration of peace to the faithful who have steadfastly trusted in God, who have an everlasting rock, a rock of ages, a rock that they can trust forever. You will keep them at perfect peace, whose mind and heart is stayed on thee. We saw the destruction of the lofty city. The lofty city could be Moab, could be Babylon of latter days. It's supposedly the unbreachable city, The stronghold really of the adversaries of God. That we saw the destruction of the lofty city, a city brought low to the dust, a city trampled by the afflicted and the helpless. In other words, the meek and the persecuted will trample the supposed glory of the world, in the end times, the lofty city. We saw the devotion of the righteous who follow a path made level by the Lord, an upright path, the constancy of the righteous, who remain devoted at all times to the Lord, waiting eagerly for him while following his laws, in the midst of his laws. By the way, if I've termed it wrong and it seems like in the midst of judgments, because I made a mistake there, the judgments there are simply them following the judgments of the laws of God. They wait eagerly for him as they follow the laws of God. They desire earnestly his name and his memory, yearning for his name and his remembrance, and they seek diligently for him in the night. They remain devoted at all times. The righteous also recognize when the earth experiences judgment, its inhabitants learn righteousness. It is good that I have been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. Fifth observation. We've only got 5 more to go. We saw the dense condition of the wicked, which is the dull condition, the callous. The wicked who, though being shown favor and grace, don't learn righteousness. They continue to deal, number one, unjustly in the land of uprightness. Instead of that, they do unjustly. They're unable to perceive the majesty of the Lord. They don't perceive God's works and zeal among his people. And by the way, I have to stop here and basically, groan, or express myself here. I believe at one time in America, we saw, we basically looked and were able to see and say, this is a land of brightness. This is a land of God, this is a land where God shed his grace on thee. We saw that about America. I don't believe, there was a time, and it's on our coins, there was a time when we considered this an upright nation, that this was a nation, one nation under God. And God indeed shed his grace on thee. Well, I don't know if I can embrace that at this point, because I think the unjust are gradually becoming stronger and stronger against the uprightness that we once had. Though being shown favor, they don't learn righteousness, and that's what's happening. We're not learning righteousness, even though God shed his grace on thee and continues to shed his grace on thee. We saw the dense condition of the wicked in Isaiah's time and in the future. We also saw the destiny of the righteous nation who will receive restoration, promises of God, the establishment of peace, the increase of the nation and its borders, and the promise of a joyous bodily resurrection from the dead. That's the destiny of the righteous, who had endured great distress and chastening from the Lord also, a distress so great that they could barely utter a prayer, a distress likened to the labor pains of childbirth, and a distress enhanced by the pain of a failed pregnancy, giving birth to wind, a non-deliverance, failing to bring about the salvation and the freedom and the prosperity and the peace, that they would have liked to, as God's chosen, but they weren't able to do so because of their own iniquity. Israel was to be a light to the nations. Anyway, there's still destined a righteous remnant among them. Finally, we also saw the demise of the wicked, who were denied a resurrection to life, punished and destroyed and remembered no more. Finally, the 8th observation, we were admonished regarding the day of God's indignation. It's a day to hide for a while until the indignation passes. Close the doors and pray, basically. It's a day when the Lord punishes the world for its iniquity. And it's a day when the earth will reveal its bloodshed, when the judge of all the earth returns. Justice for the innocent, and of course, justice for the guilty. That which is hidden will one day be revealed, even though it may be covered by the earth right now. Finally, personal application. 3 key teachings. Isaiah's teachings and instructions to us as the day of God's indignation approaches. Let me summarize it in 3 key teachings. Actually, I have a 4th one. First observation, I believe that I gained from this. Isaiah teaches us that God will keep us in perfect peace if we steadfastly trust in him, who is our everlasting rock. We may face struggles, we may face distress, painful circumstances, but he promises peace if we truly trust in him. as those who follow God's righteous path. Anyway, secondly, Isaiah instructs us, as those who follow God's righteous path, that we're to follow the way of his judgments, his laws. We're to eagerly wait on him, which means serve him. We're to remember him, his name and his memory, his renown. We're to seek him diligently in the night watches, knowing that when the earth experiences judgments, its inhabitants learn righteousness. We know that. Instructing us that when there's a way to behave when judgments come, and there's a way to react and respond as God's people. We cling to him. We wait on him. We remember him. We seek him diligently. We walk in his judgments. And we recognize the fact that when there's tragedy around us, that the inhabitants of the world hopefully are learning righteousness by it. Third observation, Isaiah instructs us that there will come a time that we may need to enter our rooms, close the doors, and hide for a little while until the indignation runs its course. It's a little controversial because I think many of us, and myself included, feel that there's going to be a rapture that happens that takes us away from indignation that's going to be poured upon us. But I believe until that time, the indignation is going to get worse. I believe there is a time that we may need to just simply enter our rooms, close the doors, and hide for a while until the indignation runs its course. We may need to hunker down, okay? Serve God and shine as a light. And I believe that we do that now. I believe that honestly, there are times in the last couple of months when I've basically thought to myself, it's just time for me to just close the door, and just close the door on what's happening in the world and just let the indignation run its course. If people are going to go ahead, if we have crazy people running our country, which we do, if we have nutty people, crazy people, unrighteous people running our country, then look, that's God's indignation. We deserve basically what we vote for. So this is God's indignation. We're going to let it run its course. Hunker down and wait for the Lord. In the meantime, though, not just do anything. Pray, let your light so shine. Impact people as much as you can. Spread the gospel. There's work to do. But I know the feeling, sometimes you just feel like just closing the door and letting the indignation get past. And I feel that way too. But there comes a time when you have to do that. I feel that way as congregations, as believers, that we come into the sanctuary of God, shut the world out, and this is where we are, the presence of God amongst us, and just wait until the indignation runs its course. Okay. Finally, Isaiah is instructing us, you don't have this, I ran out of room on your paper, instructing us that there will be a day of reckoning. Iniquity is going to be revealed and punished. God will come out of his place. He's present among us now. Scripture there, he'll come out of his place, is just, I believe, a figure of speech that lets us know that there'll come a time when God will respond to what he's seeing. He will bring forth, even as Psalm 37 says, he'll bring forth our righteousness as the light and our justice as the noonday. When that morning dawns and righteousness will come forth and justice as the noonday, as the high noon, you see that happening. There will come a day, there will be a reckoning. That's what keeps us on the straight and narrow, by the way. Because there will be, a time where we'll have to face God, and that's okay. It's the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the beginning of knowledge there is to revere and fear the Lord and know that we are creatures of a creator that we're going to face one day. And I, for one, feel good about what's happening in Yeshua, in Jesus, because he's given us a new and living way. We're right before the throne of God right now, and it's a throne of mercy towards us because of Messiah's cross, forgiveness of our sins, and him dying and paying for the price for our sins. And if you have not made a decision to embrace the Lord as Savior and Lord and receive forgiveness of sins and receive salvation, you may not be standing before a throne of mercy, but a throne of judgment. Mercy is there for you, but it's through faith in Yeshua, his work of righteousness and redemption on the cross, that allows us that grace, that allows us that mercy. I pray that you'll make that step if you haven't done so already.